let's go ahead and get started. We have Dr. Jack Naglieri here, who's a research professor at the University of Virginia, senior research scientist at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children, and emeritus professor of psychology at George Mason University. And he is well known for the past theory of intelligence and its application used in the cognitive assessment system and cognitive assessment system second edition. You can go ahead and take it away, Dr. Naglieri.
Okay, thank you. Well, hi, everybody. I hope that we can have a conversation today. And I'm going to structure it in some ways by talking about SLD eligibility using a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. But I really do hope that you'll jump in and ask questions. You can see on this first page that there's my personal email and my website. And I encourage you to take a look at the website. And you can certainly email me. I get emails from people all the time from around the country and around the world, people who've used my tests and just wanted to ask a question. And I'm always happy to answer or work or talk to people about it. So, I've published a lot of different tests. I'll talk about them as we go through today. Here's again my website, and there are plenty of handouts, longer handouts on this particular topic. I just kind of condensed it a bit for today to get us moving. I also have a section on my website with case studies, so you can actually look at the case study and the kind of interventions that were used and how the data was interpreted. Also, I have 10-minute solutions, which are short articles that I've written about, for example, dyslexia or SLD, and a bunch of articles and videos and other things. So take advantage of my website. Now, one of the 4 basic psychological processes we talk about is simultaneous processing. And what that means is that you look at a whole and you see the interrelationships of the parts. And that's what I'm going to start with you right now. I'm going to teach you something, give you a vision that's a big picture. So here's the big picture for today. I think that, and you don't need to read this, but just listen. I think what we do as school psychologists is so very important, because when you do a comprehensive assessment of a student, you will change that student's life. And that's not an exaggeration. You will make a huge difference in whether that student is likely going to be successful or perhaps not. So for me, this is a really very, very important task that we have. And we have to take it seriously for a lot of reasons, not just the legal reasons or, the professional standards reasons or the ethical standards reasons, but because we're going to influence a person. And that person will remember you. And if you can help that person remember one thing that helps them function better, that's beautiful. So that's the big picture here. Now, when we talk about our intellectual assessment in particular, what do we really want from them? Well, of course, we want to be able to practice in a way that's consistent with IDEA regulations. And those are typically reflected in state regulations. But perhaps most importantly, we want to understand why the student fails. This is a critical question. Why is the student in your office? Is there some kind of cognitive explanation or an emotional explanation or an environmental explanation, and so on and so forth? Because we really want to understand their academic and cognitive strengths and weaknesses, how they all interact. And also, very importantly, we want to assess children in a fair and equitable manner. Now, I'm going to show you evidence today. Not all the evidence, but maybe the highlights of the evidence, because we have limited time. I'm going to show you the evidence that I think very clearly shows that using second-generation intelligence tests that measure the way people think to learn is really the way to go. And I think that it's critically important that when we talk about we want to measure students' ability to think, that thinking should be defined based on brain function. Like I did with saying simultaneous processing is seeing the whole that's actually related to the occipital parietal part of your brains. Which means then that we would actually have a specific theory. So of all the instruments that have ever been made to measure intelligence, mine is the only one that was conceived from the very beginning on the basis of a theory based on the brain. That's really important because once you have a theory, then you know how to interpret the scores that you get. And that's my job. My job is to inform you of exactly how you can interpret my test from a theoretical and as that theoretical perspective is confirmed from a statistical standpoint. So the second edition of my cognitive assessment system is really focused on measuring how well a student can think and how that thinking is related to their academic success and perhaps needs. So that's the big picture. Does that sound interesting? Yeah. All right. Thanks. So let's take a few steps here. First of all, sometimes people ask me, how did you get so interested in learning and instruction as a psychologist and all? And I say, well, I actually became interested in how children learn in my first profession, which was not psychology. I actually started off as a professional musician. This is a picture of me in my very first band. I'm the guitar player, by the way. So when I was 17, I was teaching guitar. And, in the late 60s, a lot of kids wanted to learn how to play the guitar. And I realized that some kids learned really well and some kids didn't. And I really wanted to understand why. When I went to college, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but I really resonated to psychology. And even the neuropsychological part of psychology way back then, because it helped me understand about not only how people learn, but how animals learn and all that kind of stuff. Really, that's how I got interested in psychology, and that's how I eventually got interested in building my own intelligence test, because I really want to understand how people learn and how we can assess that so that we can help them learn better. So I'll show you another picture from kind of an old picture. This is from 1984. This is my friend and colleague, J.P. Das. He and I met in the early 80s, and in 1984, this was our first meeting that we had. We decided that we were going to build a different kind of intelligence test. And we were not going to be constrained by how intelligence was defined in the past. But rather, we were going to build a new way of looking at intelligence on the basis of brain function, on Luria's conceptualization of the 3 functional units, which we did in 1997, published the first edition, and then in 2018, here we are again. You can see we've got a little bit older in all those years, but in all those years, we collected a lot of information, and I'll share some of it with you today. So I want you to pay very close attention to the language that's being used here. Here are the 4 basic psychological processes. Planning. What is that? That's thinking about how you do, and here's the important part, how you do what you decide to do. In other words, there's a problem, you have to figure out how to solve it. That's planning related to frontal lobes. Attention, being alert and resisting distractions. That's related to the base of the brain. Simultaneous processing, I already told you, getting the big picture, seeing how things go together, how things are interrelated, back part of the brain. And successive processing, it's about sequencing, it's related to the temporal portions of the brain. So notice what I just did. I just taught you a theory of intelligence using ordinary words and no, some people might call psychobabble. You could explain any of these to an 8-year-old or younger, and I've done that. You don't have to be like super sophisticated in your language and obtuse in your statements to be effective. What you really need to be able to do is communicate with everybody, right? You just learned a new theory of intelligence about being able to pay attention to things, see the big picture, see how things go together, sequencing when necessary, and better use all of those and decide how you're going to do what you decide to do. That's it. It's simple. But it's not. It's really beautifully complex in terms of brain function, but it's really simple and very, very powerful. And I'll show you all that as we go through. So for really the best place to go to get more information about this, especially as it relates to the CAS2 instruments, get a look at my Essentials of CAS2 Assessment book. You can actually get a peek at it if you go on my website. I have a preface in the first chapter on my website. You can just read those 2 chapters and then decide if you want to get the book, the remainder of the book. But I think actually after today, you'll have a lot of information to make that decision anyway. But this is my friend and colleague, Tulio Otero. Tulio and I do a lot of work together. Tulio and Mary Marino work with me to create the Spanish version of the cognitive assessment system. And I'm very committed to having tools that work for everybody, especially for children who speak predominantly Spanish. You'll see that as we go through today. Okay, so just a little bit of explanation. When I talk about Cognitive Assessment System 2nd edition, really talking about really several different ways of measuring PASS. The simplest way to do it is to use a rating scale, which is on the left-hand side of this slide. This is actually something that teachers use. I actually teach teachers about PASS. My colleague Kathleen Kreese and I, she's a teacher of teachers. We do a lot of presentations for the organization Learning in the Brain. And we actually do a week-long seminar where we introduce teachers to PASS. And they say things like, you just changed my whole understanding of learning. Have a big impact on what I can do now as a teacher. So the teachers can use the rating scale. Now, you as a school psychologist can use the rating scale when you use the regular CAS, you tie them both together, right? So then you see the kind of behaviors that a teacher can observe in the classroom that reflect PASS. And at the same time, you teach teachers what PASS is all about. So there's a lot of really advantages to the rating scale. The next one on the list, the CAS2 brief, is a 20-minute, very quick version, 4 subtests, and measure one of each of the 4 areas. This is good for screening. Some people use it like you might use a K-bit or other short measures when you want a quick look. A tier 2, some of my special ed colleagues will use this as a tier 2 intervention. They're having trouble, the teacher having trouble. They go to the special ed folks give the CAS2 brief, and then they say to you, the school psychologist, hey, we got this really low score in successive processing. We really need to bump this up to a tier 3 and find out what's happening. Probably there's a learning disability here. And then the CAS2 8 subtest takes you 40 minutes. The CAS2 12 subtest takes you an hour. The advantage of the 12 subtest is you also get supplementary scales that help you interface with other data you get, like it as an executive function scale, which you can use as it relates to, for example, my comprehensive executive function scale called the CEFI, and so on and so forth. So those are your options as far as how you might go about measuring PASS. So the full 12 subtest version and the Spanish edition, also full 12 subtests. So just keep in mind, when we talk about planning, we're talking about a neurocognitive ability. Now, that's similar to things like executive function, metacognition, strategy use, and things like that, right? Because in psychology, we often use different words, but we're really kind of talking about the same thing. So that's why I like to explain this a little bit more. Right? Planning is needed for things like setting goals, making decisions about how you do what you do, but especially predicting the outcome of your goals, as well as other people's outcomes. Impulse control, of course, that's frontal lobes, and in plain English, strategy use. That may include retrieval of knowledge, like I can't do this till I get more information. Okay? This is all about frontal lobes. And it's really all about how we can use all of our abilities and our knowledge to be successful in general. We measure planning with a test like this one. So you can see that under the number 1 is OX and under the 2 is XX and so on. So we give this task and we explain to the child that they have to put the O's and X's under the appropriate number. And they understand that. But then we say, but you can do it any way you want. And then we look and see, did they do the 1s first and then the 2s? That's a strategy. Very powerful, very simple, very powerful. Attention is, as I mentioned, focus and resistance to distraction, listening as opposed to hearing. And Stroop is a really good example of how to measure that. Because when you look at this word red, and you have to say yellow, that creates a conflict. And that conflict is how we measure attention. Successive processing is all about sequencing. Anything, whether it's words, whether it's movements, whether it's speech articulation, whether it's remembering a phone number, which we don't really do anymore, because we just pick up our iPhones and they're all in there, right? If you ever lose one, you're in trouble, right? So all about sequencing. Of course, decoding is all about sequencing. Letter sound correspondence, phonological tasks. Sometimes people say to me, well, dyslexic kids, their problem is, they don't have the phonological skills. And my opinion is different than that. They don't have the phonological skills because their successive processing, which is underlying phonological skills, is problematic. So phonological test is a symptom. The successive processing score is a cause of dyslexia. So we can measure successive processing easy with recall of numbers in order that you might see or hear, or a couple of other ways that we have in cognitive assessment system. And then, of course, simultaneous, I've already mentioned to you, back of the brain, seeing things as a whole, reading comprehension when the question is, what's the best title for the story? When you're doing geometry, understanding the interrelationships of the parts, or chemistry, understanding chemical formations, math word problems, those kinds of things. grammatical statements, like put the ball in the basket under the table, things like that. We have a test just like that on the CAS. In fact, here it is. Which picture shows a boy behind a girl? That's a simultaneous processing test. That's verbal. And we mix a lot of content in the CAS. We have a nonverbal simultaneous task, a verbal one, and a memory one. We have a visual successive processing test, an auditory successive processing test, and a syntax test of the same process. We vary, all the 4 processes have subtests that vary on a number of dimensions. Of course, we do online scoring and reporting, and I can tell you now, I haven't really been able to talk about this, but we are working on a digital version now. So sooner the better, but we're working on it. And I think it's going to be really, really good. As I mentioned, the CAS2 brief is just 20 minutes, good for screening, like a tier 2. And the rating scale, I think whenever you give the CAS, you should give the rating scale. It'll help you communicate with the teacher and learn from the teacher at the same time. All right, so I'm going to pause there.